sure you think your way through it a little bit.
Hi, I'm Jackie Reid and welcome to Lethal's Last Word. We've got a couple of cracking games this weekend and it doesn't get much bigger than the first encounter. We're going to focus on arch rivals Carlton versus Collingwood tonight at the MCG. Lee, this is a vital clash for both sides.
Well, absolutely. There are always big games between Carlton and Collingwood. I always think they're the biggest rivalry traditionally, but yeah, Collingwood are trying to hang on to that 8th position at the moment, and Carlton really won. They've got to beat a side above them, so this is their chance tonight.
Well, let's take a look at the last 3 weeks, and it's been over a month since the Blues last win back in round 10 against the Giants, while Collingwood was travelling okay with 3 in a row, but stumbled last week against the Power.
I think Carlton's a little bit better than it looks. I mean, that wet weather didn't help them last week, and they were in the game until Sydney kicked the last couple of goals. Of course, Collingwood dropped the game to Port, and have been struggling along with a lot of players out of their team that they'd love to be in there to be at their best.
Well, let's take a look at your key stat for the match, and it's the fact that both teams have had trouble converting their inside 50s into goals.
Well, it's actually the similarities between the two teams in terms of this basic number. They're both getting the ball into their 50-metre area. I mean, that's where they can generate a shot at goal. But both are pretty ordinary at converting those inside 50s into goals. Problem is, if you don't convert them into goals, they come rebounding out via kick-ins or just rebounds out of defence. They've both got to tidy that up.
Well, the Magpies seem to rely on Travis Cloke a fair bit too. They go to him 42% of the time. Do they need to change anything up against the Blues?
Well, they can't. We saw last week with Port, every time I saw the ball go into Collingwood's forward line last week, it was Port, the Cloke was outnumbered 2 or 3. So if you get, they just can't find a second effective target. They were hoping Quinton Lynch was going to do it, but he's out injured anyway, been playing pretty poor. So they've got to find more from those subsidiary forwards, and maybe they've got to think about a bit of repositioning.
Well, let's take a look at that. Your key players. Firstly, you want to talk about a couple of swingmen that could provide that sort of a role. You've got Ben Reid for the Pies and Lockie Henderson for the Blues.
Well, both sides, I reckon, have got that problem. How do we find a second effective target in the forward line? And certainly Ben Reid played forward against the Lions 4 or 5 weeks ago. Lions were really under strength. Collingwood won easily, but he was pretty good. And can they afford to get either Reid or Henson? Both sides are in fact in the same situation. They're both trying to find a second effective target, and whether they can reposition one of their big defenders who are playing well into the forward line. Well, that's the coaching challenge. But when you're in the middle of the list and struggling, sometimes you have to take that risk.
Well, what about the Blues? They need to rely on their little trio of little men there, Jeff Garlett and Eddie Betts and Chris Yarran. They need something from them this week.
This is one part of the game that's fallen off for Carlton the last few weeks. They've been competitive with really very little contribution. Garlett hasn't actually kicked a goal or tackled much in the last 3 weeks, so he's been poor. Betts hasn't been much good. Yarran's been sub a couple of times. Don't think sub suits his psychology myself. I'd be very surprised if he starts in the subs vest against Collingwood. But all three of them can be really damaging. I'm not sure whether three of similar types in the team at the one time, because none of them play in the midfield. They're mainly just small forwards. But nevertheless, if they play well and Waite plays well, Carlton's forward line is much more capable of scoring than they've been just recently.
OK, Lee, let's go to your last word. Who's going to win?
Oh, well, I think Carlton. Collingwood's got too many players missing. Jolly's out, O'Brien's out, Beams has been out all year, and we know Carlton have got Murphy and Carazzo back into the team. So I think tonight, this week, I think Carlton are better, ready to play well and should win.
OK, that's Lethal's last word on the huge clash tonight between the Blues and the Pies. To what is a highly anticipated contest and maybe a grand final preview, Lee. It's Geelong versus Hawthorn Saturday night at the MCG. The Cats have won the last 10 and these two have got quite the fierce modern rivalry going on.
Well, they have since that 2008, the surprise loss by Geelong to Hawthorn in 2008. They've just had such fantastic games, and 1 versus 2, you can't get much more exciting than that as we get into this round of the year.
Well, let's take a look at their respective draws from the last 3 weeks, and a blip 2 rounds ago by the Cats up in Brisbane, but these two sides have been in ominous form, haven't they?
They have been in terrific form. Hawthorn have lost 1 game, obviously won the 12 games since that round 1 loss to Geelong. Geelong have only lost the 2 games, and one of those was just that last quarter fade out against Brisbane, so both sides in really good shape.
Well, what about the key stat? We're looking at the performances of the dynamic duos in attack when these two sides play each other.
Well, as we know, the Cats have beaten Hawthorn the last 10 times they've played, but I think that's history. The last 3 is the one you're really important, and in those games, the big forwards for Geelong have kicked 19 goals between them. Hawkins and Podsiadly and Franklin Roughhead have kicked 7 between them in those 3 games. So clearly, the Geelong big defenders have been able to do the job better than their Hawk counterparts.
Well, let's take a look at the matchup for these foursome, beginning with the Hawk pair. Which Geelong defenders do you think are going to go to them?
Well, Lonergan normally plays on the Franklin-type player. Taylor will probably play on Roughhead. I think they'll be the main matchups, and they're such good players. They always like to get Harry Taylor Geelong floating off a little bit, but they're good big defenders. Neither of those two players have been cut up by opposition forwards. They're good in the air, but I think Lonergan on Franklin probably, and Taylor on Roughhead when he's in that part of the ground. Now, Hawthorn, obviously, they've got Brian Lake in there, so he's the new element in this equation. But Josh Gibson will have to play on probably Podsiadly, and I found Podsiadly has just looked too big for Gibson in previous occasions, so it is still a problem for Hawthorn. But Brian Lake didn't play in round one. This is the first time he's played for Hawthorn against Geelong. He's been recruited, so he's at least the best matchup you can find for young Hawkins.
Well, you've got an interesting key tactic, and it's the versatility of some key players at Hawthorn.
I think Hawthorn have really all year tried to be more flexible. Franklin is less their target in their forward 50. He'll get up the ground. And their midfield group, the three of them, you've got Burgoyne, you've got Hodge and you've got Mitchell. All of them will bob up in defence every now and again, playing off the half-back line. They can be in the centre square. They can even sort of go into the forward line, certainly Hodge can. So they're really flexible players, and I think Hawthorn have just made a deliberate tactic this year to be less predictable and more flexible.
Where do you think these three are best suited?
Well, I don't mind Luke Hodge playing up the half-back line, but we saw I think against Carlton about a month ago when they were getting stitched up in the middle, so you put Hodge in the middle. You get the hard body in there. I think Mitchell is still a fantastic clearance player, so I think it'll be horses for courses, and depending upon how the game goes. But I would have thought when the crunch really comes, Mitchell will be in the centre square.
Well, what about for the Cats, their key players, Christensen and Duncan? Well,
only because we know that Steve Johnson's out of the team, and it happened that Christensen and Duncan, two young Geelong players, they were their highest disposal gatherers in their really good win last week against Fremantle. So this is why Geelong have maintained being such a good side for now 6 or 7 years, because they keep finding this next generation of players that have become really good contributors, and certainly last week probably almost career best games for both Christensen and Duncan. So given you still got Selwood, you still got Kelly, you still got Bartel, but those two players, if they can produce that form again this week, then Geelong will go a long way towards beating Hawthorn. OK,
Lee, last word. Can the Hawks get over this curse?
I think they can. I think they're going better than Geelong just at this point of time, or it's a big statement given Geelong have only lost 2 games. But you've got to pick a team, so I think Hawthorn might win this week.
OK, let's go to all of your tips for round 15, beginning with the Blues versus the Pies.
Well, I'm going for the Blues. I think for me, it's about a 6 out of 10 Carlton's way with the teams they're fielding. I think the Bulldogs, I don't know, this is really, they're both going poorly, but I think we'll go for the Bulldogs to beat the Giants. Richmond should beat the Kangaroos. That's about a 7 out of 10 times for me. I think the Lions at the Gabba, they'll beat the Suns 7 out of 10, so I would go for the Lions. Hawthorn, well, it's close enough to a 50-50 bet, but we'll go for Hawthorn. Adelaide, West Coast, they're still unpredictable, West Coast, but I think Adelaide maybe a 6 out of 10 at home at AAMI Stadium. The Swans, well, they're probably, even in Melbourne, they're probably going to beat Melbourne every time they play at the moment, so 10 out of 10 for them. And the side that St Kilda fielding is quite poor. Rewald's out, so Dockers, I reckon, is almost a 10 out of 10 at Subiaco at this point of time. And I think Essendon Power have been fantastic. Their defensive pressure has just been outstanding recently. But I think Essendon probably a 7 out of 10 in Melbourne, even though the Power in really good form.
Well, thanks, Lee. Which game are you most looking forward to this round?
The Hawthorn-Geelong one, 1v2, and it's always an exciting game between those pair of teams.
It should be a good one. That's it for Lethal's Last Word. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.